Hello, church history friends. I'm Barb Walden, and I am thrilled to welcome you this evening as we kick off our brand new series, Hands on History. This new series is like no other series we have ever hosted. So now that you're here, I hope you'll stick with us because over the next 3 weeks, we will gather with four individuals who are actively involved in preserving Community of Christ history. They're actively involved in preserving that heritage in a variety of different ways. So tonight, we'll explore the importance of oral history as a form of preserving the past. And in the weeks that follow, we're going to learn more about serving as a local historian and recorder in Community of Christ. We'll learn about digitizing congregational records and managing a mission center archives and so much more over the next 3 weeks. So I'm going to do a quick screen share to share more details on what you can expect in this new series. Our hope is that throughout the series, we'll all learn a thing or two about how we can preserve Community of Christ history in our own neck of the woods, even if that means preserving our own stories. So as I mentioned today, we're meeting with Magen Edvalson, and Magen is going to talk about You Are Legend, preserving the folklore of our sacred story. Magen will share what is folklore, how it relates to Community of Christ heritage, and ways that we can actively help preserve that. Then next week, we're going to be gathering with the Community of Christ librarian and archivist, Rachel Killebrew, and she's going to talk to us in more detail about what it means to be a congregational historian or a mission center historian. Rachel's presentation is Preserving Your History, Tips and Tricks for Both Tangible and Intellectual Retention of Congregational Records. We'll wrap up the series on September 11th with Karen Norton and a special guest, Andrew Hughes. Karen is managing and helping preserve the church archives in the British Isles Mission Center. And she'll talk about how she, a volunteer, is managing this large collection and what it is she's looking for in helping preserve Community of Christ story in the British Isles. A highlight of that September 11th night will be meeting Andrew Hughes and learning about how he, as a volunteer and member of the El Cajon congregation in California, will learn about how he's digitizing old videotapes and recordings from sermons that were given in the El Cajon congregation many decades ago. He's not only digitizing those records, he's putting them online on his own YouTube channel, where you can go back and hear sermons from former Community of Christ apostles and a number of other ministers who made their way through the El Cajon congregation. So that is incredibly exciting. And of course, we would not be able to host this new series or our fall lecture series or our Alma Blair internship program or the annual Historic Sites bus tour or any of our educational programs without your generous donations. So thank you so very much for giving over the years to help support the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation, because it's with your generous funds that we're able to host new programs like tonight's Hands-on History with Magen Edvalson. In case there's anyone out there tonight who'd like to give, you can see there's 3 easy ways to help support the Historic Sites Foundation. You can do it through online giving, gifts through the mail. We'll even take gifts through the phone. So Wendy will drop the online link in the chat for those wishing to make a donation tonight. We know there are a lot of outstanding educational organizations out there to support, and we really thank you for thinking of us, friends. We couldn't do this kind of thing without you. Now, 2 people who really need no introduction are Peter Smith and Wendy Eaton, who have helped out with these online programs for quite some time, and I couldn't be more thankful. Peter serves as a board member for the Historic Sites Foundation, and he's also co-host of our annual bus tour. So welcome, Peter. And Wendy serves as the administrative assistant for us here at the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation, and as a co-host of the popular Project Zion podcast series, the Cup of Joe episodes. So welcome, Wendy. It's good to see you. I am so excited tonight. I am stuttering all over myself and I can't get words out. So thank you all for being patient with me. I'm almost done with these opening remarks. We have a great program planned for tonight, and Wendy will drop the schedule in the chat to give you a better idea of what to expect over the next hours. So friends, we always look forward to your questions that happen after the presentation. Please post those questions in the queue, that Q&A feature that appears at the bottom of your screen. It's the questions that are posted in the Q&A that we go to right after the presentation is over. So send your questions to the Q&A and we'll get to those as soon as Megan wraps up the program tonight. Speaking of Megan, our guest speaker this evening is the great Magen Edvalson. Megan is an oral historian and project coordinator for the Community of Christ. Megan is a folklorist by training, and Megan has earned a master's in American Studies and English from Utah State University and a bachelor degree in theater production and design from the University of Utah. As soon as they could read, Megan has been fascinated by paranormal folklore and Mormon history, interests that have inspired a deep passion for preserving the songs, the jokes, and even the spooky stories that we hear around the dying campfires at reunion. When they aren't entrenched in research, which happens all the time, Megan can be found experimenting with textile crafts, can be found swimming, reading, or hiking. They live in the western foothills of the Cascades, where their spouse and four-legged children, yay! Tonight, Megan is going to talk to us about preserving folklore, the work of an oral historian, and the exciting details behind Megan's role as the Oral History Project coordinator for Community of Christ. Megan's presentation tonight is called You Are Legend, Preserving the Folklore of Our Sacred Story. So welcome, Megan. I'm happy to turn the spotlight over to you, and we are ready to learn all about folklore and oral histories. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Okay, thank you again to the Historic Sites Foundation for inviting me to speak on oral history and building congregational resources on local history. Today's topic is one I'm very excited about because it's one I don't get to talk about very often, despite it relating to my academic interests, and that is folklore. Did you know that you are legend? Or rather, that your life experiences in the church are a quiet piece of history? Well, that's what we're talking about. Our expressions on the most fundamental level of our church lives are part of the folklore that informs our congregational story, and it's an understanding of folklore that I believe can best prepare us to build congregational histories and be better stewards of our sacred story. In order to talk about folklore, excuse me, it's a good idea to understand what folklore is. Most people, if asked, would probably say something like, folklore is for children, or folklore is all falsehoods wrapped up in fun stories. Folklorists, however, would tell you that folklore is neither fact nor fiction. It's fact in that it might be based on factual events, or that it factually exists in the form of cultural artifacts that we create. But it's fiction in that it is highly subjective or exaggerated. That all might make more sense as we go, but a good start to understanding what folklore is meant to be is by looking at the word itself. William Toms was a British writer who loved British culture and trying to understand its roots. He lived at a time when Europeans felt a certain draw to understanding their own national heritages. It was popularly believed at a time of intense political change that the essence of a nation's identity was found amongst the peasant class rather than the highbrow culture of the aristocrats who were often intermarried foreigners. Toms felt inspired to break down the idea of British culture into a word drawn from pre-Norman language, so he created a good Saxon compound from the word folk, meaning people, and lore, meaning instruction. These words are noticeably present in our sister languages of German and Dutch, as well as our modern English word learn. Another word we've already mentioned that is similar to the concept of folklore is culture, but there are big differences. Number one, the word culture is French, and therefore wasn't good enough for Toms to represent a society of Anglo-Saxon descendants. Number two, culture often prioritizes hierarchy, just like the Saxons were defeated and made subservient to the Normans. If you know your English history, this should be making some sense. The word culture today can embody folklore, but it is just as often defined by art, music, literature, and other things that have been deemed appropriate by those at the top of a social hierarchy rather than those at the bottom. The idea behind folklore is that it is instruction of the common people, emphasis on common, by the common people, rather than the definition of culture, which might be the instruction of all the people by the elite class. Folklorists today will tell you that folklore is still rather hard to define as we understand today, and especially in the melting pot of the United States. Tom's original concept can apply to several groups, including economic classes, colonizers and colonized, generational groups, regions, ethnicities and races, orientations and genders, religions, etc. The anthropologist Ward Goodenough summed folklore up best for our purposes as whatever it is we need to know or believe in order to function within our community groups. As we understand intersectionality and identity, we find that no one can identify exclusively as a peasant or an aristocrat, as Tom saw society. Today, we understand that we belong to several groups all at once. Let's now consider what makes folklore folklore with the example of hopscotch, which is folklore. First of all, folklore is informal. You don't learn it officially, and it isn't considered necessary for basic survival, though it definitely helps to function in the social group where you learn it. Because it's informal, it can be difficult to pin down exactly how we picked it up. Though you might have a memory of playing hopscotch for the first time, you can't be absolutely sure you didn't know what it was before, or that you hadn't seen a hopscotch board before. By the time you played it, it was probably somewhat instinctual based on how you'd been exposed to it. The second characteristic builds on the first. Because it's informal, folklore is also transmitted through common interactions. So maybe you watched your older siblings or neighborhood kids play hopscotch when you were a baby and too young to remember observing them. Maybe your mom bounced you from number to number before you could even walk. Those are all common interactions. The third characteristic of folklore is that it is created at a grassroots level. This is perhaps the most important distinction between folklore and culture. Culture, remember, often means that some sort of elite approval is involved, whereas folklore just sort of happens and eventually melds in with culture by means of dissemination or exposure. Hopscotch, for example, is usually something created temporarily for entertainment and then left to disappear by the elements as it isn't in use. Nowadays, though, it is not uncommon to find hopscotch boards painted permanently on school playgrounds as a school-approved activity. This is not because adults invented hopscotch, but because those adults were all children once who learned to play hopscotch and grew up to be teachers who recognized that it was a common game that children would instinctually play. So why not paint it on the blacktop? Because hopscotch has been so widely disseminated, it has earned a degree of elite approval and a place in culture. Perhaps the best and most unique thing about folklore is that it changes over time and space, meaning that there are no official rules regarding folklore. The hopscotch board you see here probably looks very different than the one you used to draw as a kid. Maybe yours had more or fewer numbers or different shapes. Perhaps you used chalk to draw it, or pebbles, or a stick in the sand. Maybe you added rules like clapping the numbers, or skipping the even numbers, or throwing a stone on one and skipping that number. Maybe you grew up not even calling it hopscotch at all. Herein lies the purpose of folklore scholarship. It's our job to collect all the different ways in which these things are expressed, made, or behaved as a way to better understand small groups and how they relate across miles and generations. Folklore is discovering and analyzing clues for a mystery you don't even know you are solving. So I know that was probably pretty mind-blowing and maybe a bit intimidating. You might be thinking that folklore is everything, which can be overwhelming to those of us who like to compartmentalize and organize. I really appreciate people who are good at organization where I am not. So let's try breaking folklore is everything down to folklore can be categorized. In folkloristics, we call types of folklore genres, which are understood in the same way or a similar way that we think of literature genres. You already probably know a lot of folklore genres, but let's consider some basic genre umbrellas instead of trying to list them all. First, we have genres of things we say. These include the sorts of narratives or language that you might use in different contexts, like work or school, or around the bonfire at reunion. We know what folklore works where and how it's different in different settings and with different people. You know not to tell dirty jokes at work, but you might hear them in the locker room at school or the gym. You would expect to hear, Father Abraham had 7 sons, at reunion, but you definitely wouldn't expect to hear it at the Strawberry Festival in your hometown. Next come the genres of things that we do. These might be festivals that are celebrated by various cities and countries with their own spin on things. Consider that in India, spring is celebrated by throwing colorful chalk at each other for the Hindu holiday of Holi, whereas in England, spring is celebrated by dyeing eggs with vibrant colors for the Christian holiday of Easter. Are these the same holiday? No, they aren't even based in the same religion. But there are some really interesting parallels that might be explored by folklorists. Next, we have genres for things we make. These are typically called folk arts, but they can also include the ways we make things. We've all seen lace, but did you know that there are hundreds of ways to make lace? You can tat, knit, crochet, bobbin lace, or even cut it out of paper. We can often look at folk art and identify the communities or regions they come from. You can probably tell that this is an Alaskan totem pole, but a more accurate way to refer to this is as a Tlingit kutia, because the word totem is derived from an Anishinaabe word and shouldn't be considered outside of their cultural and folkloric context. Furthermore, the Tlingit people are not restrained to borders such as the rest of Americans are, because they historically have followed along the coastline of the Pacific Northwest and aren't strictly Alaskans. Therefore, this is not just an Alaskan totem pole. It's important to make those distinctions so that we understand the differences and nuances, and we can appreciate those different cultures. These distinctions are important to be aware of as we consider different social groups, because it should be our first priority as social scientists to represent group identities and contexts as accurately as possible. This is especially true as we consider the last umbrella of genres, the things we believe, which are genres that can be the most controversial. These controversies may derive from a lack of understanding, such as the European colonizers in Africa regarding the gorilla as a cryptid until their scientific classification in the 19th century, or from our own projections of prejudice, such as the fact that the word gorilla was used to name the species because it was an already common Greek term meaning tribe of hairy women and used as a pejorative by Europeans for indigenous peoples. As you may have guessed from the previous slide, there is a lot of potential for crossover between genres at any given moment. That's because our folklore reflects our folk values. These values are, like folklore in general, hard to pin down exactly because they often are not directly defined by the social group that holds them, but can be suggested by careful analysis of common themes that bind a social group's folklore together. This is where we need to be mindful of how we talk about folklore and what its impact is. Folklore is not just whimsy and harmless fun. It can also reflect dark prejudices and impact marginalized members of our own social groups in very negative ways. Consider the Community of Christ tradition of reunion. Now, this is not a tradition I grew up with because I did not grow up in the church, but it was one of the first experiences I had with the church. I was blown away that members would take so much time of their summer to attend, and I felt fully accepted as a member of my local congregation because of the powerful devotionals, fun activities and traditions, and friendships I made through this folk tradition. On the other hand, reunion is not always a good experience for everyone. Historically, and perhaps even currently, Black members of the church across the United States have been met with prejudice and segregation in their congregations and at reunion because of old superstitions and folk values that the majority members in their congregations upheld or enforced. Roger D. Launius wrote in his book Invisible Saints about the traditions of segregating reunion camps, swimming pools, and lakes, and the serving of separate communions to Black members in their home congregations. These instances of racism are not systemic, meaning they have never derived directly from the official church policy. They are developed from ideology and folk behaviors that have been left unexamined, primarily by white majority members. As we look at our own congregational structures to collect our folklore, it's absolutely crucial that we consider both the things we love about our congregations and the things that our congregations need to improve on. In the United States and Canada, that should include the ways we include or exclude minorities. Does your congregation have a high concentration of members from diverse races, orientations, or economic backgrounds? Why or why not? How does that compare to the demographics surrounding your congregation, and what does it say about your congregation's values? Now we come to the part where we connect our folklore to history. Maybe this has been a lot to take in, and maybe you're still wondering why folklore matters when we're talking about church history. Typically, when historians talk about church history, they are talking about specific events that affect the whole church. As the Oral History Project coordinator, the main focus of my job has been to interview retired appointees and World Church employees, including retired World Church Leadership Council members, because their histories are what inform us about policy changes and major events. However, what we need to remember is that all these leaders are also members of mission centers, priesthood quorums, and congregations as well, and the things that happen at those levels are also important because they can permeate through the boundaries of these groups. A lot of us as members may fit in with two or more of these tiers at one time, and we carry our folklore and history together with us. Take a moment to consider your congregation and its history. What stands out most? I think a lot of us might say that not much stands out. We worship on Sundays, attend reunion, baptize our kids, hold funerals, have holiday parties, and repeat the process every year. Are any of those things particularly noteworthy as historical events? Maybe not, but they still tell our story because all folklore is history, even if history is not all folklore. So in collecting our folklore, we are essentially collecting our history. Historians also require verifiable documentation in order to ethically and accurately tell the story of events. Folklore, as we practice it, is not necessarily documentation. We can put up a Christmas tree and take it down, and while we may have the same tree and ornaments that all exist as folklore artifacts, they don't always count as documentation unless we have written stories or photographs of them when they are up and decorated in the context of being a Christmas tree. Folklorists study and work to preserve documentation of folklore because it changes over time, and because we know that historians will want some documentation later on when they study the history of a group. In this sense, the folklore that we collect is more like a time capsule of a moment, and we can make new time capsules again and again and never be finished because folklore changes so much over time. While church history focuses on specific events in the story of the world church, it can only be as vibrant in its recording as the documentation taken from the several tiers of our community social structure. What Joseph Smith III grew up doing and believing as a child informed his presidency over the church as an adult, and it is nothing like the experience that Stacey Cram has had or will be informed by as the president of the church today. Your congregation matters far more than you might realize. Now that we have an idea of what folklore is and how it relates to history, we should probably talk about what to do next, which is to collect it. There are many ways to do this, and most of them are pretty easy. You might want to look for or create written documentation first. These can come pre-existing as letters, journals, or histories that talk about folklore in the past. You may want to ask members for their own writings or write down the favorite songs you sing on a regular basis, especially at camp. The songs we sing may be familiar across the country, but you'd be surprised at how much they can differ in tune and lyrics based on region. Collecting all these versions is exactly what a folklorist would do. You might also consider collecting samples of writing that has been unique to your congregation, such as a periodical newsletter. In the Salt Lake City, Utah congregation, there was a novel written by a member, Elaine Steinen, in the 1980s that has become a cult classic in the congregation because of the way the story resonates personally with many members. Because it is out of print, finding a copy is difficult, but succeeding in getting one and reading it has become something of a rite of passage in their community. As you can guess, cult media like cult films, cult books, cult TV shows can be considered folklore, as well as rites of passage. Other items to collect include folk artifacts, namely crafts and decorations you might find in your congregational storage closet. As you find these items, take photographs and write down the memories and reflections of members as they come up in sharing those artifacts. This is a great way to preserve artifacts that you can no longer keep as things break, fade, or simply fall out of relevancy for the current generation. Sometimes you'll get lucky and artifacts of impact, things that aren't necessarily folkloric but are connected to the folklore of your congregation, you'll find those things, sorry. This note is an apology letter written to the Ogden, Utah congregation from a young man who broke one of the church's windows. What you may not know, unless you are familiar with the Ogden congregation, is that their windows are broken on a semi-regular basis, making this letter an artifact of what has become somewhat of an inside joke as well as a frustration that Ogden members are privy to. Finally, the most proactive way that you can collect folklore is by taking audio and video evidence. This can come in the form of interviews, home video recordings of events, or recorded tours of the chapel or reunion grounds. And for this example, I wanted to share a video that was taken by our oral history intern through the Alma Blair internship, Courtney Karchner. She took a video of the Ogden congregation. Oh, see if I can go back there. And I'll warn you that the sound isn't great and we won't watch all of it. But I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of ideas that you could implement in your own videos. Now, Courtney said that she took this video on a phone. She didn't have any special equipment. She downloaded a basic free publish or editing software and put it together.
It in Ogden, Utah, and attended the
down to 15.
church when I was about 2 years old. 3 is my first
You'll
memory.
notice that the sound quality is not
My
great.
grandmother brought me.
So if you want to hear
these Reynolds,
I'll try to talk over it just or I may it more. You can turn your speakers up.
She was the first of our family that started attending reorganized church. This is Jenny.
So we have Jean here talking about the history of the church.
I think this is a sister Ethel, but I'm not sure. But their maiden name was Gar, which is a historical.
And she talks about construction.
Antelope Island.
I want to skip to a part
It still has a
relevant
ranch
to our discussion today.
that they are source of.
Oh, we'll start it here.
from down here rising through the register. So,
Again, the sound quality is not great. So if you can,
okay, this is our one
take it-
prized possession.
you can find lava lavaliers that are fairly inexpensive
We
from
still
Amazon.
have it.
And you can
From the
connect
old chapel,
want to take a phone video,
original,
iPad
with
video,
the chapel, And the finish in it
Talking about
is called faux finish.
Megan, this is Barb. We're having a hard time hearing
When
you
things were
over
made, they
the speakers
okay.
and video.
Okay.
So if you could just pause the video and then share with us what you have to say, I think we'll be able to hear you a lot better.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we're on a tour here of the Ogden congregation, taken by Courtney Karchner, our intern for the oral history project, and she's on a tour of the building. And I just wanted to kind of focus in on this moment. The sound quality isn't great in the video, and that's, you know, you can hear it okay if you're watching it on a phone or on my computer, but you may not hear it as well. But one of the things that she is talking about here is this podium. And while she talks a lot about the history of the building, I love this podium because she talks about how it was constructed by the members, and it's one of their prized possessions. And she talks especially about the fact that this is made out of pine. And if you know anything about pine, you'll know that it is not a hardwood, and it doesn't have those grooves that you want, or the lines. I don't quite know what to call them, but they don't have the lines that you see in hardwoods. So it was a common practice in this part of the country to make things out of pine, which was available, and then paint those lines in there to make it look like oak. And so this is their prized possession at the Ogden congregation, and we'll just go a little, skip ahead a little bit.
All of the hardwoods that were in the east, so they would use this fake painting. So originally, in the chapel, the walls were covered just with a so-high wainscot around, plus the doors and all the woodwork around the windows. It was all this finish. And then when we moved the church from 15th up here, the walls were damaged and they took the wainscot off and didn't save it. So that's why are those big brown walls in there now. But they did save this, that's an amazing piece. Yeah.
I love this part. You can see it's all worn down from people holding onto it.
I want to pause it there because I love this comment. And this is, I mean, Courtney's a brilliant historian. She wouldn't consider herself a historian, but I love that she added this slight comment about the rubbing off of the paint, showing that this is not only an artifact of folk art, but it's also something that is used and it has meant something to people. And I'm sure that people understand in this congregation the history of rubbing the paint off. And maybe that's not something we would record for an official history, but it adds that texture and that flavor that really helps make history feel alive and made up of real people. So we'll go ahead and skip to the next slide now and finish off with some helpful tips. We are almost done, but before we finish, I want to offer these tips to get you started on your congregational folklore collection. First of all, it's a great idea to have a designated historian who is folklore aware. Being folklore aware can help us see opportunities to collect important information even when nothing particularly historical is going on. As you collect items for your collection, be sure to prioritize diverse voices in your congregation. This should include children, members of different races and orientations, friends of the congregation, members who have stopped attending or have moved, people with different abilities, etc. Every member of your congregation belongs to different groups outside of church, and all of them will bring valuable insight from those perspectives. Collecting folklore can get overwhelming, but don't stop doing it. It may be something you plan to work on at an annual event for the congregation, or it may be something you contribute to monthly, but any small bit of work is helpful and can go a long way. It's also a great idea to share your collection online. As so many congregations transition to online platforms, it's easy to forget that we are still deeply rooted in personal interactions, and folklore must be shared in order to be worthwhile. Social media is a great way to do this. Congregational Facebook or Instagram accounts can be easy ways to archive your photos and videos without having to keep them on your own hard drive. This can also drive up engagement with other congregations or even connect you with people in your city. These engagement opportunities can help us transcend the hard things that divide us, including harmful folk values, like we've discussed. So don't shy away from tough topics. Your collection should reflect your congregation, including its imperfections or even the ways in which it has been neglected. Folklore should not be just about celebrating ourselves. It is also a very useful tool in critically thinking about where social change needs to happen for people who are harmed by prejudice, subjective to their prejudice. Sorry, looking at my notes. Be prepared to face criticism and don't take offense. Because folklore is so informal and subjective to variation, it is very easy to fall into stereotypes and assumptions. Save those awkward interactions anyway for others to learn from, because collecting folklore is ministry. By hearing other people's stories and finding the value in the small material things of their lives, we not only validate the people we draw folklore from, we are allowing them the opportunity to teach and minister to us. Finally, I have 4 resources here that should be helpful. Most of this presentation was based off of this very short book, Folklore Rules, a fun, quick, and useful introduction to the field of academic folklore studies by Lynn McNeil. Lynn is a professor at Utah State University, so I certainly have a little bit of favoritism towards her book. It is very short and not at all written like an academic book. I think it's just less than 200 pages, so you could probably finish it in a day if you were so inclined. But it goes more into depth about the things that we've talked about today. The next book I recommend is The Story is True, The Art and Meaning of Telling Stories by Bruce Jackson, who is a folklorist, filmographer, and journalist. I think this book has gone through 2 printings and may not be printed anymore, but you could probably find it through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or through your library through interlibrary loans. I think I've also seen it in some academic libraries. Again, this is not a difficult read. It's not for an academic audience, so it's pretty manageable. And the reason I like this book and I recommend it to everyone is because it really gives a good idea of what truth is in folklore. Truth is subjective and maybe a little objective, but there's some variety there in what we mean when we talk about truth in folklore or personal truth, things like that. And really it's about how we connect to each other and frame our narratives to interact with each other and share folklore. The third book I'm going to recommend is Doing Oral History by Donald A. Ritchie, and this is very much a manual that should be accessible to anyone. It's pretty easy to read, but it can be a little dense. There are several editions of this available. You should be able to find copies of this fairly easily at used bookstores or online. I think I got mine from Powell's. I live in Oregon, though, so if you're familiar with bookstores, Powell's is a big one. They have just about everything. I would recommend trying to get a more recent edition. I think it's in its 4th or 5th printing, and I would recommend getting a more recent edition because a lot has changed in the last couple of years with technology and IRB rules and regulations. So that's a really good resource. I've also written what I call Doing Oral History as Ministry, and I'll drop that link in the chat when I'm done here, but it should be coming out as a printed booklet that you can get through historic sites. I think we're still working on that, but I'm hoping that we can also make this accessible on the website. But for right now, you can email me or I will drop a link in the chat. And that is it. That's all I've got.
Well, that was a lot. You say that's all I've got, but we have learned so much tonight thanks to you, Megan. You also serve as the oral history coordinator, and I'm fascinated with the job that you have. Can you talk a little bit about what it is that you do, and also talk about some surprises that come about in your position, in your role? Like, as you were recording some of these oral histories, was there a particular interview that you had that surprised you, or new history that was revealed that just blew away the way that you had interpreted that particular era or that particular person's story? Um, what are some of those moments that you've had where you thought to yourself, I am so lucky I get to do this. How great is this? You know, I have those moments all the time in my position, and surely you do as well. And I'd love to have you share some of those moments.
Yeah, I've been doing this for about 5 years now, and at first I approached Locke Mackay, who I knew we knew that there needed to be a reiteration of this. This has been something that has been done for a while in the church, but it's not always stable. Sometimes it ebbs and flows. And I took not a crash course. It was a very intensive course through the Library of Congress in my graduate days. And it was about how to do folklore or how to do oral history. And so the first week of that intensive course, we did research. We talked about theory and methodology. And that's kind of where I started with this is building up that background in theory and methodology. And then from there, you start to kind of figure out who you're going to talk to. And from where we've been interviewing mostly appointees and employees. And so there's a little bit of history already built into the Herald and the resources that we have in the archives based on, what those people have been appointed to, where to go. And so it starts with research on individuals. We kind of select some names and we start researching their background based on what we have. Then it's about devising questions to ask. And those questions, they can be as general as, where were you born? Where did you live? Where are you in terms of your sibling age group, or where'd you go to school? What did you study? All that kind of thing, all the way down to, when you were called to this location at this time, there was this great controversy. What was your experience with that, and how were you involved in mitigating that? So it can be very very broad and general, and also get very very intimate very quickly. And so, as you can imagine, with that, interviewing takes a lot of time and preparation, mentally and research wise. You really need to build trust with people. And that's one of the things that I find difficult, but rewarding, is building that trust with folks. I'm an introvert, but I really love people and I really love hearing their stories. And it's done a great deal to bring me out of my shell, to have these opportunities to talk to people and get to know them, get to understand where they come from, and really build a sense of empathy and sympathy for me, for them. And it's taught me a lot about the church. I mean, like I said, I wasn't born a member. I wasn't raised in the church. And I always kind of assumed that, the RLDS Church, now Community of Christ, was this great progressive institution that is looking forward to the future and doing wonderful things. And I learned that, there are some dark skeletons in the closet there that are difficult to grapple with and difficult to talk about. And that maybe that there's some work that needs to be done to sort of, reconcile with the past a bit. And so I'm hoping that that's something that can come about from this project. So after the interview, we take that audio and we transcribe it. And that is probably the most challenging thing, because transcribing can take a very long time. Not many people are interested in doing it after a while, because it can be very tedious. Fortunately, we have great technology that helps with that and makes it much more easy to push through and get a draft out. And so all we have to do is really edit down what AI can transcribe for us. And then we archive it and we move on to the next one.
Well, thank you for the work that you do in preserving this history for both today's generation and future generations. Well, friends, time has flown by this evening, and I'm afraid it's time to draw our program to a close. Again, Megan, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us tonight and for helping us kick off our brand new Hands-on History series. You've certainly started an awesome momentum for us moving forward with Rachel Killebrew next week, along with Karen Norton and Andrew Hughes, having to follow you in the weeks that follow. Also, a great big thank you to Peter and Wendy for helping out behind the scenes. It's really great to have you back and back on the screen for these online series. Thank you so very much. And we also want to thank everyone for joining us tonight and for your continuing interest in preserving Community of Christ heritage. Tonight wasn't like our normal church history lectures. We are trying something new, and you all are pioneers with us with this new hands-on history. We'd love to get your feedback, love to hear new ideas that you have about areas of preserving history that we need to explore. Friends, we're really all in this together. So thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for continuing your love of a good story, as well as your generous support of the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. We couldn't have programs tonight without people like you. So thank you so much. As I said, we're not done yet. We hope you will join us next week as we welcome Rachel Killebrew, a Community of Christ librarian and archivist. She's going to be joining the series, and her presentation is called Preserving Your History, Tips and Tricks for Both Tangible and Intellectual Retention of Congregational Records. Wendy has dropped the link in the chat where you can be among the first to register for next Thursday's program. I think, like tonight, next Thursday's program is one that you're not going to want to miss. So thanks again for joining us this evening and for helping us kick off the new series. We look forward to sharing with you next week. So friends, until then, keep reading your church history, and please do take care and have a good night.